Let's go ahead and get started. It's 6:30. Welcome. This is a scoping meeting for the Environmental Impact Report for the Onni Christie Mixed-Use Project. I'm Charlie Bryant. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Emeryville. With me tonight is Miru Desai, Senior Planner, who is the project manager for this project for the city. She'll be processing the application that has been submitted to the city for this project. We also have our consultants, our EIR consultants, our urban planning partners, and that's Lynette Diaz and Meredith Rupp. There in the back, and then Rob Reese is with us from Fair and Piers. He'll be doing the traffic analysis that will be in the EIR. You'll note that there's nobody sitting at the dais because this is not a city council or a planning commission meeting. Neither is this a study session or a public hearing on the project. Those will be scheduled in the future. The purpose of this meeting is not to discuss the merits of the project itself, what you like about the project, what you don't like about the project, what you want to see changed about the project. This meeting is not about that. This is a meeting with city staff and the city's EIR consultants, and it's an opportunity for responsible agencies and the public to weigh in on what should be included in the EIR for this project. Our consultants will be making a brief presentation about the project and about the EIR process, to be followed then by your comments. You'll note that there are speaker cards. I put them all around on each chair, so if you wish to speak, please fill out the speaker card and give it to me, and I will call the names in the order that I receive them. We will be maintaining a 3-minute time limit on each speaker, just in order to make sure that we get through everybody's comments and to make sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to be heard. So we'd ask you to be respectful of the time limits and respectful of each other's comments. This meeting is being televised and recorded, so please speak into this microphone when you come up. I'm going to swivel this podium around after the consultant is finished presenting so that it'll be facing over towards us, so you can direct your comments to the staff and the consultants. It's a little bit different than the way we normally set up city council and planning commission meetings. If you have questions about the project or the EIR process, you may include them in your 3-minute comment period. We will take note of any questions. We won't answer them right then and there. We will collect all the questions and we will try to respond to them at the end of the comment period. If you don't have enough time in the 3 minutes to say everything you wanted to say, or if you prefer not to speak, or if you think of something later after this meeting that you wish you would have said, you can submit written comments until Friday, April 19th. So that's until 2 weeks from tomorrow. And Lynette Diaz, our consultant, when she makes her presentation, will tell you about how you can submit written comments. And with that, I will turn it over to Lynette to make the consultant's presentation. And I'll pick, if you have speaker cards that you filled out now, I will take them. And then if you want to fill them out later, you can bring them up to me.
Thanks, Charlie, and good evening. Get arranged here. Well, thank you for coming out tonight. We are, as Charlie mentioned, working with the city and for the city to prepare the environmental review of the project that's proposed. And we're really here tonight to hear from you. Wow. Really hear from you about your concerns of what you want evaluated in the EIR. And our objective is to provide an objective analysis that's not advocating for or against the project. It will really provide analysis so the city decision makers can make informed decisions and there can be an informed dialogue about the potential environmental consequences of the proposed project. So I'm going to just briefly go over the basics of the project, as that is the project that we'll be evaluating in the EIR. talk about the CEQA review process, review the topics that we're anticipating evaluating in the EIR, and then provide an opportunity to hear comments from you. So I think most of you are familiar with where the site is, so I won't go into much detail or any detail there. And then the project, as it's proposed, is to demolish the one-story, 44,000 square foot building that Allegro Ballroom is currently in, and to retain the 7-story commercial Wells Fargo building, and then to develop 2 new towers, the 54-story residential tower that would include 638 units, and then a 15-story office tower and a half-acre park. Do you want to point out there were some minor errors in the NOP, and it said 628 units, it's 638, and then also it stated that the units would just be rental. They may be rental or ownership. And the office tower was listed as 16 stories. It is proposed at 15. And there was a height discrepancy as well, the 638 versus 683. Those will be corrected in the EIR and considered as such in our analysis. So we're at the initiation of the environmental review process under CEQA, and the city determined upfront that an environmental impact report is required or will be prepared for this project. And as I mentioned, this is really the purpose of the EIR. The primary purpose is to serve as an informational document for the community agencies that are have involvement in the project, as well as the city. The city of, under CEQA, you're required to have a lead agency. The city of Emeryville is the lead agency for this. Urban Planning Partners is the consultant working for the city on this. And then the project sponsor applicant is Onni Group. So with the CEQA process, we're early in it. We're in the scoping session, scoping period. The city issued the notice of preparation on March 20th of this 2019, of this year, not last year. 30-day scoping period is from March 20th to April 19th, and tonight, April 4th, is the scoping session. We anticipate that the draft EIR will be published in fall this year, and then there'll be a 45-day public review period. It's published as a draft EIR. We want to hear from the community and anybody else interested, agencies, about the adequacy of the analysis. Hopefully we'll provide an adequate analysis, but sometimes something is missed, so it's a draft document. And after the 45 days, we're required to prepare written responses to every comment that's received that addresses the adequacy of the EIR. We are not required to provide written responses to the comments that address purely the merits of the project. I don't like how tall this building is. I want it to be a different shape, that type of thing, unless that's associated with an environmental impact. So in providing your comments, both on the notice of preparation as well as the EIR, that is really helpful if you consider that in your comments. And then that will be compiled into a final EIR that will include the written responses, as well as any modifications to the draft EIR that are needed in response to the comments received. And hopefully that will be in early 2020. And then the project, the city anticipates, would be considered for approval by the Planning Commission in spring of 2020. The notice of preparation, as I mentioned, was published on March 20th. It was sent to the the state, which they distribute it to all the state and regional agencies that may have interest in the project. The city also additionally directed a direct mail to the to BCDC, the Airport Land Use Committee and Commission for San Mateo and Alameda counties, respectively, AC Transit, BART, East Bay Mud, and Caltrans. The scope of the EIR, we have listed the topics that we anticipate analyzing: aesthetics, including wind impacts and shade and shadow on adjacent properties; air quality; biological resources; cultural resources; greenhouse gas emissions and energy; geology, soils and seismicity; hazards and hazardous materials; hydrology, water quality; land use and planning; noise; public services and utilities; traffic and transportation. We do not anticipate that effects will be significant related to agricultural and forest resources, mineral resources, population and housing, and recreation. And
Advance the slide.
we do not anticipate that under CEQA there will be significant impacts as a result of the project related to these four topics. And I can imagine that relative to population and housing and recreation, there could be some questions. And I'll talk a little bit about significance and what's significance under CEQA and what's not, and there are criteria that establish that. For population, the criterion is the displacement of housing units or people. So when you're tearing housing down, replacing it with a commercial development, that type of thing. So the threshold for population and housing under CEQA is just, this project doesn't hit that. The project is also consistent with the city's general plan, and so the population was considered as part of the general plan process as well. And then relative to recreation, the project will be required to comply with the city's standards for that, and part of it will be achieved by the proposed half-acre park, and then part of it will be achieved by payment of park fee. So that is not something that would be significantly impacted as well. At least that's our preliminary findings. Those topics will be briefly discussed. We won't be silent on them, but we are not proposing to do any detailed analysis related to those topics. So what is significant? That's always really something important and somewhat challenging to understand in the world of CEQA. CEQA defines it as substantial or potentially substantial adverse change in the environment. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what is substantial? And so if the color, kind of a really simple thing that I use is, changing the color of a house is not substantial. That's really simple, basic. And then adding a certain amount of parking or something that's not going to result in significant impacts per the measurable thresholds for transportation and such. And wind, if the wind increases a little bit, is that a substantial change? It's like, well, how much does it have to change it to be considered substantial? And so there's for most of these topics, there's quantifiable thresholds and guidance that we use for determining that. And we look at what is on the ground today and then how it will be after the project is developed and look at that net change. And so that is how we determine significance on a very simplified way. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rob Reese. He's a principal with Fair and Peers, and he's going to talk a little bit about vehicle miles traveled versus level of service. And the state is now mandating that traffic analysis focuses on vehicle miles traveled and not level of service, which is also consistent with the city's general plan. So I'm going to let him be the expert and talk about that a little bit. Thank you.
So I'm Rob Reese with Fair and Pierce. I'm a principal with the firm, and I'll be overseeing the transportation work for the environmental impact report. So Lynette had talked about that there's a shift in the way that transportation is being evaluated from a CEQA perspective. And that shift is going to vehicle miles traveled. So I'm going to talk a little bit about vehicle miles traveled, talk about why the shift to this approach for evaluating CEQA, and then talk about how we mitigate project impacts that are related to VMT. So vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, if this graphic illustrates it pretty simply. If you have a car, a single car, and it drives 1 mile, then that's a VMT of 1. If you have 4 cars and each one of those cars drives 10 miles, then that means you have a VMT of 40. So it's a pretty simple calculation that is made. And so let me talk a little bit about what vehicle miles traveled is. It's really about mobility, and that's the ability to move long distances quickly, or excuse me, that's what we used to do, is mobility, moving long distances quickly. And this is an example of somebody in a suburban environment that might leave their house, drive 2 miles to get their coffee on their way to work, where they drive 10 more miles, and then they drive home 11 miles, and then they go out to a restaurant, driving 2 miles. They're running out of gas because they've been driving around all day, so they go and get some gas on the way home, and they end up having a VMT of 29. Basically, their car has been driven 29 miles that day, and so that's how it's calculated. Where this is coming from, this originally started with some state law changes around greenhouse gases. AB 92 and SB 997 focused on greenhouse gases and making them part of the CEQA analysis process, since greenhouse gases affect the environment. What they started to realize as they implemented that criteria is that it was treating both greenfield areas, so that would be like out in eastern Contra Costa County, where you have the rolling hills and no development. They were treating that as the same as a development in Emeryville or Berkeley or Oakland. And so they started to implement some other state bills in order to address that issue, recognizing that people in the inner urban area drove vehicles less than people out in eastern Contra Costa or Alameda County, for example. And so they started to make exceptions, and they ended up deciding that they needed to develop some new criteria to analyze impacts. And that's where we came up with SB 743. So this slide does a pretty good job of illustrating the differences. The top slide is about mobility. It's about moving your car quickly. What that's showing is that an intersection is being widened dramatically, and that's occurring because we're trying to move cars through the system, and we aren't paying attention to transit, walking, or biking. And so what happens is, in the old way of doing things with CEQA, you would always make roads bigger and wider and have more lanes. Whereas what SB 743, the new CEQA guidelines, is trying to do is recognize accessibility. And so accessibility would be taking that person on the previous page that drove 29 miles, if they then were in more of an urban area where things were closer, maybe they could walk or ride their bike to get their coffee in the morning. and then maybe there would be a bus going by every 15 minutes so that they could take the bus to work. And so all of a sudden you're stripping, if you look at accessibility, you're stripping out all of those vehicle trips that are occurring that is resulting in making roads bigger and wider and more lanes. So that's kind of the context of what the state was trying to do, is to shift to accessibility for CEQA purposes. One of the concerns about doing that has been around safety. There were some in the industry that said if we move to accessibility, we will be making our roads less safe. But the state had done some research, quite a bit of research actually, that showed that in fact in urban areas with streets with slower speeds, with people walking and biking and using transit, that those streets were actually safer as an overall sense for the community than the big arterials that they've built out in some of the greenfield areas. And so one thing to keep in mind is that if we move to accessibility, we're changing the way that we look at a project. So project impacts used to be about widening roads. Now project impacts are about minimizing vehicle trips. And so to minimize vehicle trips, you do things such as provide increased density. If you have increased density, more people in a smaller area, then buses start to work better. Walking starts to be more viable. Diversity of uses. Can you get your shopping done at the same, just next door from where you live? Distance to transit. How far do I need to walk to get to a bus stop? Development scale in the context of the rest of the community. These become things that we look at in order to minimize vehicle trips. So what does SB 740 not do? It doesn't touch your general plan. It doesn't touch your impact fee program. It doesn't adjust the state constitution and your policing powers as far as land use and development go. It doesn't change your subdivision map act. And what that means is that while you need to study VMT, vehicle miles traveled, you can also study other things as well. So you could continue to study intersection operations. Do the signals work well? Do you need a new signal? Do you need to widen a sidewalk or provide a bike lane or provide a transit stop? Those are all still under the purview of the city to decide how to evaluate them, but they are separate from CEQA. So there is a non-CEQA analysis that is done in order to capture some of those items that I mentioned, a signal, bus stops, sidewalks, that sort of thing. Whereas the CEQA analysis looks at vehicles miles traveled. So the guidelines identify some criteria for vehicle miles traveled. They, like I'd mentioned, they feel that it's a more appropriate use because it's about accessibility. The state feels that VMT should be studied everywhere. There are opportunities for projects to get exempt from being evaluated. Those projects, though, need to meet some strict guidelines around parking, density, and proximity to transit. So VMT, I had mentioned, is basically the vehicle trips times the length of each trip, and that gets you your VMT. It's a quantifiable measure. There are 3 ways to measure it: activity-based models, trip-based models, spreadsheets. The MTC, our regional governmental agency, utilizes an activity-based model to come up with screening criteria. And then we use, as the evaluators or the analysts, we also use the Alameda County's model in order to evaluate the implications of VMT. So it gets looked at in different fashions. So I had also mentioned that the mixed use projects, redevelopment projects, those are the types of projects that might have some special circumstances, unique projects, and so the state guidelines do allow for flexibility to evaluate VMT in different environments. This project being residential and office with some retail and some open space is a pretty common set of mix of land uses, and so we won't need to develop any unique tools or methods for evaluating this project. We'll be able to use tools that have been used in the past that are consistent with past practices. When we start to look at how to mitigate a project, just to give you a sense of what we look at, again, if we were looking at intersection level of service, we would be looking at expanding roadways and widening roadways. But instead, we look at minimizing trips. And so up here is a list of ideas for that we've measured in order to show that we reduce vehicle trips. And then we have tools that we use in order to look at different project characteristics. So if we increase the amount of residential or decrease or increase the amount of office, how does that change the number of vehicle trips that get generated by the project? And again, we're looking at, when we make mitigation changes, we're looking at making changes to the project either physically, or we're looking at making changes such as transportation demand management tools to reduce vehicle trips and to promote person trips through transit, walking, or biking. And so with that, we'll go back to Lynette.
Thanks, Ron. All right, we're almost done talking. So CEQA also requires alternatives to be considered in the EIR, and some of them at least need to be alternatives that would reduce or eliminate some of the significant impacts of the proposed project. And so we will be working, it's a reasonable range. You don't have to do every single alternative that could possibly be out there. But the idea is to come up with a reasonable range that, again, provides more information to understand the potential effects of the project. And relative to, if you reduce it, does this impact go away or not? So that will also be included in the EIR, and we have not identified any of those yet. And they also need to attain the majority of the project objectives. And so it can't be just something completely different that doesn't meet the objectives. And the project sponsor will provide objectives, but the city will also have objectives. And then we also look at the cumulative analysis of the project, and what that means is, as I explained earlier, we look at existing conditions today plus the project, and then what's the change that occurs between today and when the project would be built. And then we also look at what would it be like in 30 years, 25, 30 years. We typically look at, with everything else that is anticipated or could happen during that period of time, what will the project impacts be with or without that? Because some change is going to happen no matter what. Maybe not on this site, but on other areas within Emeryville and around Emeryville. So we want to make sure we consider it in that context as well. And I didn't forward my slide. So we are back at where we are tonight. We're at the EIR scoping meeting, and as we mentioned, the comment period will end on April 19th. You can provide comments tonight verbally. We do have a time limit to be respectful of everybody here and their time, but there's lots of opportunity you can provide written comments to Meru up until April 19th, and you can email them, you can mail them, or hand deliver them. So with that, actually one more, just so you understand the next steps, which we'll visit this again at the end of the presentation, the end of public comment, but we're going to start working with city staff and preparing with our consultant team, preparing the draft EIR, the 45-day public review period that we discussed, and this is just kind of a reiteration of what I went through earlier. So thank you, and we can,
Fine.
there we go. And there is Meru's information to make it as easy on you as we can. So with that, we'll go ahead and start having comments.
So I have 4 speaker cards so far. Meru will come and collect any additional ones. I'd also note that I got a blank one. Somebody handed me a blank one. So if you think you meant to fill one out and you didn't, you might fill it out. All right, I have 5 speaker cards so far. I'll call 3 names so that you can be prepared to get up after the person in front of you. First I have Ron Freund, then Fran Cattell, and Mary Eileen Farrell. So Ron Freund.
Well, my name is Ron Freund. I live in West Emeryville. I hope Charlie will be a little bit lenient given the small number of people tonight. Anyway, this is a very serious issue. There was a recent report by the United Nations Global Climate Council that irreversible global warming is going to occur much more imminently than had been previously thought. So your analysis and report bears a heavy burden of responsibility for whether this project is supported or opposed by the community. I want to make sure that the report covers not just the impact once the project is completed, but also during the construction phase. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Nathan told me it was 2 to 2.5 years in length. So that's a long time. So I want the report to examine the impact during that time of noise, air pollution, and the use of heavy equipment. I went to a recent conference where they said that the state of California for road construction is now using hybrid and even electrically powered heavy equipment with the new technology. I'd also like to have the sourcing, the type and environmental impact of the energy and materials used for the building. For example, will the materials from the demolished building be used as part of the new building process? And where will it be sourced from? And also, what LEED ratings you can assign to this project and what it would require to be at the different levels. A long-term impact would be on the road maintenance of Powell and Christie, which long after this project, the rest of us city taxpayers will have to cover. And then let me see if there was anything else. Oh, and then I'm hoping finally that you'll look at other projects of this type, because apparently this is either the 3rd or 4th largest residential tower west of the Mississippi. Of course, with Millennium Tower sinking, this project may move up to number 2 or number 3.
Thank you. Fran Quattel?
So I live in Emeryville, and I serve on the Budget Advisory Committee, and I appreciate all the comments that Ron made. I want to first begin by saying that in Florida, there have been many studies that have pointed to more intense hurricanes because of the buildup of population, and I am very concerned with the effect on climate and what happens to the population here, and also whatever environmental factors might be exacerbated by this project, which incidentally, I can tell you my opinion of this project is that it's atrocious right from the get-go. So I would like to have a copy of the presentation. That's my second thing. My other questions, these are just questions, and I'd like them included. Has the study included spending any time at the intersection involved? Ron mentioned the intersection of Christie and Powell. And also in the maze, have you studied the maze traffic? That's one question. Are you coordinating this project with the maze redo? I would like, and maybe this will come up as something concerning my committee, I'd like to know the tax revenue that would accrue to the city and the fees that would accrue to the city, and I'd like to know the expense that the city would endure with this project. I'd like to know the length of time to construct the project. I'd like to know who went to whom to conceive of this project. And I'd like to know if there's any funding of public transportation in this project. So those are all of my initial thoughts. And I might have some more as this project goes on. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Eileen Farrell, and following her, Finley Robbins and Joyce Jacobson.
Thank you for this time. I live in West Emeryville also, and I'm obviously learning how this is structured, and it appears as if this project is confirmed, and we're not allowed really to give our opinions in general. So speaking to the talking points, and hope that we have an opportunity to speak later on in general how we feel about this. Is there parking for all the units? It's my understanding that there is not in your plan, where you're going to reduce travel by encouraging people to use bicycles or public transportation. We have serious parking issues in Emeryville, and we're dealing with them. And a lot of it is because people must drive to their jobs here, and they must drive to their jobs elsewhere because public transportation doesn't take care of it. So these people who will not have parking places in the new structure will be parking on our already congested streets, for which we do not have at this time parking enforcement, and it causes chaos on our roads. Traffic congestion is on that street is going to be contributing to one of the worst intersections in the entire country. Our Powell Street 80 intersection, Christie, is a mess often and immovable. The recent changes have made it somewhat better, but during high traffic times, it's impossible. I've seen the plan from the Parks and Recreation Committee, where I'm a member, and the plans show that people leaving the parking garage will be turning left onto Christie, or turning left into the parking lot from Christie. That's going to need its own parking light. I mean, a stoplight there, because of the congestion, and that's just going to back up that traffic even more. It's impossible now. During busy times, it's going to be worse. You can't go down to Bedrock. Bedrock is what? I don't know how far down. They don't even know. One of my neighbors said she spoke to one of the developers, one of the family members and said, "Are you going down to Bedrock?" And he said, "No, they don't know where it is. It's sand, landfill, and mud." I think it's very likely that this tower could lean too, because there's not going to be any way to attach it to something firm. May I have can someone cede a minute to me or two? May I have a couple minutes? Thank you.
All right.
Eugene Sui wrote you a letter about air pollution. This building is going to have increased carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and toxic materials building it. We're very concerned about that. Parks and Recreation require at least a ½ acre of parkland. I've seen the plans. They need to be improved. But if we're going to add 1,200 to maybe 1,500 to 2,000 people in this tall building, if more than one person goes in a unit, we need more park space. Will this company consider buying a building that's vacant and letting Emeryville put a park there? For every 3,000 people, we're supposed to have an acre. We're adding about half that much to this. Almost done. The population displacement of seniors who can no longer live here due to inflation of rents and ownership will be affected by the rise in the cost of rent. It just keeps going up and up and up. You're going to put expensive apartments there. You may have a few token ones for lower income people, but it won't apply to someone like me who's on a very small fixed income, and I'm having to think about moving to a foreign country to be able to live out my elder years. I don't want to see the rents go up and displace other people whom I've known personally who've had to move, and one became homeless and still is. What about the shadows from this building covering up the views of people? It's a mess in every direction as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Finley Robbins?
Oh, I'm next, I think. You said Joyce Jacobson after?
Well, I read your name
You said her, and then you said Joyce Jacobson.
I did? Okay. All right, fine. That's fine.
Seniority takes, okay. Okay, I've got a couple of different things here. The first is the current issue of the National Geographic has a great article on building cities for the future using high-rises. And I really wonder whether we're asking this company to meet the standards that's outlined in the National Geographic article. Okay, that's number one. Number two is to the list of things to be concerned about. One is not environmental, but economic. I think that the construction period is going to destroy business at the public market because of the congestion. People coming from out of the area are going to give up going there, and also the Powell Street market especially. And what's going to happen to those businesses, and what's going to happen to the sales tax that supports the city of Emeryville. Okay, I came in a few minutes late because we had a hard time figuring out how to get in here, but I've found listening to both of you, you were talking in the technical language of your trade, and honestly, I don't understand half of what you were saying. So I wish you could summarize for me in 2 or 3 sentences in plain English what you were talking about, and then again a sentence or 2 about how the VMT fits into that.
Okay, we said we'd respond to questions at the end.
I'd like to have a response.
We'll respond at the end when everybody's finished commenting.
Oh, okay, all right. That's it.
Yeah. So this is Finley Robbins, followed by Paul Burnett, and then Sue Kelly.
Finley Robbins, also never heard of it presented like that, West Emeryville / Watergate, in case you're wondering. So quickly, I wanted to address one thing and then talk about one of the slides. On top of what Mary said, Eugene Sway, I know, has written letters to several different agencies and newspapers. And one of the things that he's pointed out tremendously concerns me about the CO2 emissions. And as an international architect, he calculated the amount of CO2 emissions to be more than 17 tons a day. And he's an incredibly passionate man about topics, and he looks at it globally, that all the cities that have built skyscrapers in the past, and certainly in the future, inadvertently are contributing a like amount into the atmosphere. So of course I bring up the naysayers for climate change, but how we are affecting that. And so I really would like that looked at in the environmental impact report, and the effect on everything, not just Emeryville, how it affects the soil and the water. So one of the slides that was shown talked about, let's see, the not significant effects. And I wonder, because it was 4 categories: population and housing. How could that not be a significant effect when there are 638 units? People are going to be commuting to jobs. It's going to affect the traffic patterns, the getting on and off freeways, the bridge traffic. And then what falls under the category of recreation? Is that traffic and parking as part of that? So how can that not be seen as a significant effect on this EIR? And I think basically that kind of hits the topics that I'm most interested in, the CO2 and the effects of that, and really the environmental effects, the building materials themselves, and the HVAC systems, the ventilation, the heating and cooling. And this is the first high-rise. When they start putting in even more, I think it's going to be pretty devastating to what's already a major international issue with climate change. Thank you.
Paul Burnett.
My name is Paul Burnett. I guess I live in West Emeryville. I live in Pacific Park Plaza, 30-story building already. So. Ooh, no, sorry. I have a couple of questions about the Onni company's experience in building on liquefiable soil, which everybody seems to admit that this is liquefiable soil underneath the 2 tall buildings. Has anybody given any thought to the effects on the underground storage tanks for the gasoline and diesel fuel that's sold at the gas station, which is just a few hundred feet away from where the pilings will be driven? Liquefiable soil transmits the shock very, very strongly. Is anybody going to look into the other infrastructure, water pipes, sewer pipes, that are going in the immediate vicinity of those pile driving operations? Does the Onni company design or construction people have any experience building on liquefiable soil, or building within 1,000 feet of a seacoast, or building just a few feet above sea level, or building close to earthquake faults such as the Hayward-Rogers Creek Fault, which is just a few miles away? I don't know. I'm just curious. I believe that's an environmental issue that should be looked into. Thank you.
Last card I have is Sue Kelly.
Excuse Excuse me, I'm Sue Kelly, also in West Emeryville. I went to the meeting at the Hilton a couple weeks ago, and we thought it was going to be a presentation, but it was a four-poster, four people from the company talking. And I just happened to grab one man who wasn't surrounded by piles of people yet, and he turned out to be the vice president. But anyway, I asked him if we were going to go to bedrock, and he said, no, there's no bedrock. And he said, there's a very solid layer down there that will be used. And I said, well, also there's a problem in the city with the steel they're using. Are you going to get a different steel company? And so he said, well, we're not going to be using much steel because it's going to be concrete. So then I just happened to be watching Science Channel one night, and they had a program on engineering disasters. And the first one they interviewed was the Millennial Tower, which turns out one of the architects was there, and they were talking about what they all did to make it really good. It turns out they didn't put the pilings into this hard surface down there. They just left them in the space in between, thinking it was going to be a steel building, and it would need to go into the bed or whatever that layer is. And at the end of the program, one of the architects was there, and he said, we realized it was sinking, but he said, then my grandson was over one day, and he was playing a game with marbles, and the marbles were all rolling toward one wall. And he said, when I saw that, we moved out the next day, because I knew it was, not only sinking, it's tilting. And then the other program that I saw was just the other night, and it was about glass buildings, one in England, which tilts a little bit. And what happens when the sun comes out is collects all those rays on those little bits of glass that are outside the building, and it transfers it down to the buildings across the street, which are all having to get fans and air conditioning because their buildings are turning so hot. And they showed how it was frying eggs on the sidewalk because of all this glass reflecting onto that area, and it was at 245 degrees down there. Then there's another building in Las Vegas, which also had a tilting building, and it went, sun comes in, goes down onto the pool area. Nobody can use the pool area because it's 200 and some degrees, and if you sit in it too long, you'll die burning to death. And so I wondered if any of the engineers have thought about catching the western rays of the sun beaming down on the freeway. I just kind of wonder, and also what they found out about the Millennial building was in the middle of it, they changed it from steel to concrete, and that made the building millions of pounds heavier, and so the little piles are just kind of floating down there somehow. And what they have to do is put more piles in, which is going to cost billions of dollars. Has anybody, could we be reassured that the engineers know about this? Because these are put up by very smart engineering firms that know what they're doing.
The EIR will consider soil and stability.
And the glass.
Yes.
Because we're bending the building.
That's your 3 minutes, ma'am. So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your comments.
I think that's all.
Thank you. Looks like we have one more speaker card. Okay, Penny Thamkel? Yes. Okay, go ahead.
My name is Penny Tam.
Speak into the microphone here, please.
Oh.
You can address
I
us.
like to look at your face
You
too.
can face.
Facing that. Okay. That? I want to look
That's
at you
fine.
too.
It's fine. Face the mic and walk us to the
Yes. Did you hear me?
Yes, that's fine.
Stand a little closer to it.
Okay. My husband and I own the building, the 5-story next to your building, And when I hear about change, you are coming into town. My husband and I live in Emeryville for a long time, and we also work here. We love Emeryville. We used to be in San Francisco, and Emeryville is totally different. People here seem to respect nature and environment, and the staff at the city is very friendly, and everything seems very, very progressive, and we always get help from people at the city, which is to my surprise. So we love it. And when I hear about the change, part of me is concerned, but then I also love change because I like progress. So part of me is welcome the change. I love your plan, say having park. I even imagine myself walk there. But then with the building that tall, I am unfamiliar and a little bit afraid because I know this is our landfill. We all know. And since I'm not technical or engineering, part of me is concerned. But then again, since you said you have a lot of experience, you build so many places, so I feel good. So I love to see it, but then in the back of my mind, I question the integrity of your company. And I start to look into it. I search online. I saw people have lawsuits about your company. Okay, that's maybe some specific reason between you and them, but a lot of people do. But for myself, recently, I sent your company a letter. You own the next building, which is not far from me, and we kept contact you about your water. Your building has been releasing water illegally.
Okay, can you wrap up, please, ma'am? Can you finish up, please?
Yes. So your water is pouring down the dirt between our building, and you damaged my building. Recently, I hired a plant company who is very good with foundation, come and help out. And they spelled out all the problem you have created to my building underneath. We have water like a foot high.
Ma'am, your time is up, please.
Okay, so I sent you a letter. I would appreciate you see something to help this little problem, to show that you are reliable.
If I can just say, in response to that, this company does not own the property next to you yet. They are in contract to purchase it in the future, but they do not own it now. So they are not the owners of that property next door to you yet.
I'm glad. I'm glad. It's a very good news because the previous owner just don't care. You can go when it's rain, the water just flood to the neighbor all over the plant, the rat and everything.
Okay, that's fine. That's all the speaker cards I have received. Is there anyone else here who wishes to speak? All right, I heard a few questions in there. I think Lynette took down some. Let me just try to answer a couple, and then I'll turn it over to Lynette. Let me say, we have a copy of the presentation here, and we have enough for everybody. So we're going to pass that out right now. And I'd just like to say in response to Joyce Jacobson's concern, it's a little difficult for us to respond because, you know, you said that the presentation was in technical jargon, which I don't dispute. It's kind of my language too, so it's hard for me to figure out what was the jargon and what was the plain English. And I think it will be difficult for the consultants to address that as well. So what I'd like to ask you to do, if you could, is look at the presentation. And if you have specific questions about what you consider jargon in there, come back up and ask us, not right now, but in a minute. You can ask us just exactly what it is you're unclear on. The other thing I just noted is there was a question about whether construction impacts would be addressed, and the answer to that is yes. Construction impacts of the project will be addressed in the EIR.
I'd like to just say, we can start with the first page where you've used
Yeah, okay. All right, fine. Let me let Lynette go through the questions that she has noted, and then we will address that issue of the jargon.
I think you covered most of them. I do really appreciate the comment about the jargon, and we might have been a little bit light-handed in defining terms, so I apologize for that. But we will be happy to answer questions here. I also would be happy to sit down and go over it with you in more detail. So the first I'm realizing we did not define EIR, which is an environmental impact report, and I really apologize for that. That was definitely an oversight on our part. You all raised and shared really good comments. They will definitely inform our analysis. I want to emphasize, though, it seemed like there was a little bit of thought that we had already started our analysis and we were well underway. We are just starting. And so that's why we have this meeting, to hear from you about these types of comments. And so what we will do in the EIR is consider these comments, and where it is appropriate in a CEQA document, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, we will address those and make sure, and if it's not, we'll explain why. So you will have that context, and we will draw from expertise of other tall buildings. We've worked on a lot of them, and have our technical consultants as well.
So, Joyce, did that answer your question, or did you have further questions about? Did you want to come back to the podium and?
I will speak when we're finished. I'll speak with her directly.
Okay.
But I really just wanted a very simple statement
Right.
about the state of California requires us to do et cetera.
Right.
Just simple language.
Right.
And this is what we're about. And I don't know what the VMT, but how that fits in at all, or why that's important.
Right. Well, perhaps a one-on-one conversation with Lynette and Rob after we adjourn would. Okay. Actually, if people want to say more things, I'd ask you to come back to the mic, because we are televising and recording this, and they won't pick it up if you're not speaking into the mic.
Just a quick question. Is the EIR limited by regulation to what CEQA wants, or can our comments broaden the scope of your report? Because it seems like some of these definitions, like especially the issue of the housing, are so narrowly drawn that it doesn't really deal with the concerns expressed by many of us.
Well, let me take a cut at that, and Lynette can chime in if she agrees. CEQA, as Lynette said at the beginning, the California Environmental Quality Act and the Environmental Impact Report process is an informational process. It's to inform the decision makers about what the consequences of the project would be and how to mitigate them. But there is a lot of case law, a lot of court decisions about what CEQA means and what is included and what is not included, and we need to be consistent with all of the legal decisions that have been made up until now. So there are certain things that would be included in environmental impact report and other things that wouldn't be, and there's certain state law that says how it should be treated. In addition to the CEQA law itself, there is also something called the state CEQA guidelines, which is something that the state has produced that kind of interprets the law and gives further clarification on how you write an EIR and what has to be included and what is not included. But I just want to emphasize that the EIR is just one aspect of the approval process for the project. The city can impose conditions of approval and consider factors about the project that might not be covered by the EIR. That doesn't mean that that the Planning Commission can't consider those factors in their decision-making process.
So they can?
They can. They need to be able to make the findings that are in our planning regulations. They need to follow the rules that are laid out in our planning regulations, but a lot of that stuff does not relate to CEQA.
No, I know some of the questions weren't related,
right,
like taxes and fees.
Right.
One other quick question. Apparently there's legislation now going through the California legislature. I believe it's called the CASA Compact. And I think a subcommittee just reported out that it's moving forward. Now, to your knowledge, Charlie may be the best on this, will that preempt much, if it were to pass?
Well,
would it preempt all of the work that
oh no,
will be
I don't
done?
think so. It's not gonna undo CEQA.
But I mean,
there are something like 270 different bills related to housing, many of which relate to the CASA Compact. And at this point, I don't think anybody knows which of those bills are going to pass and which are not. And the ones that do pass, how they're going to get modified as they go through the legislative process. So it's really everybody in California, all the planners in California, we're all scratching our heads saying, what the heck does all this mean? We won't know until those laws take effect. Meanwhile, we don't expect the CEQA process, the environmental impact report process for this project is going to be significantly affected by that legislation.
But can the city take a position? Can you or will you take a position if it looks like the law would preempt much of our
The city council
control?
certainly takes positions on legislation from time to time. At this point, there are so many bills out there that I don't believe they've taken any specific position on any of them yet.
Okay. Thank you.
Were there some other questions?
I have a follow-up question here. It seems that, and I'm just trying to grasp what you're saying, that with CEQA, the influence of this project on the entire area, you are not studying the broader influence of the project. Is that correct, that CEQA is limited to just the project and the immediate area, or are you studying the impact on the broader area? And I think that's what we're all saying this in a variety of ways. And I think it's important for you to hear that that's what this city and the people who live in it really want to hear. Not just the CEQA requirements, but the broader requirements.
Well, the EIR will cover the CEQA requirements. If there are additional issues beyond that, that can still be considered in the planning process. But I would note that certain impacts are very site-specific, and other kinds of impacts are much broader than that. There are certain kinds of, particulate emissions that are very specific to the immediate area, as opposed to greenhouse gas emissions, which go all over the place. I don't know if you want to elaborate.
Yeah, when you said broader area, are you meaning geographic area or topical areas?
I mean, this The city of Emeryville is 1 square mile, and what you're proposing is building in the highest density area of the city, and also that area flexes for traffic and probably is 10 times the amount of, oh, I don't know, I'm making that up, maybe it's
Okay.
2 times, 4
I
times.
understand what you mean.
Yeah,
now, though.
but that area flexes for a very much higher density at significant portions of the day. You're not just building housing for 638 people and an office structure. And I think the concept of just meeting the CEQA requirements for that piece of ground, that is just laughable as far as I'm concerned. It seems nonsensical.
Well, I want to clarify, for CEQA purposes, we don't stop and say, this is the Emeryville city limit, or this is the edge of the site. You know, we look at where there's going to be change as a result of the project. And, you know, we need to look at, you know, is that going to be, you know, air quality throughout the Bay Area? So as Charlie mentioned, each topic has, you know, soils is pretty specific to the site, air quality, not so much. And so we adjust our analysis based on the type of topic. And then we go out as far as we need to go out to say that, you know, determine that there's not going to be any significant impact if we don't analyze 2 more cities away or whatever. So that we will do within the CEQA analysis. And we also, as I mentioned, look at the cumulative of what other projects and development and growth are anticipated over the next 20 plus years, and that together with this, what will be the impact?
I just have one final comment about this. Everyone has mentioned the condition of the soil and the fact that it's liquefiable, and that and that is the typical soil in certain areas of Emeryville. And I am really concerned, in addition to that particular site, I don't want somebody 58 stories up finding themselves waving in the wind during an earthquake, which has happened. I've been in earthquakes at top of Bank of America building, and you just feel that the whole building is tipping one way or another. I'm concerned about the effect of loading liquefiable ground on one area of this city and the effect that it might have on other surrounding structures. And I'm just horrified, I'll use this word.
That will be
hear,
analyzed.
Yeah, I think these things that everyone is saying are things you have to hear.
If
Thank
you
you.
refer to the presentation, you'll see on slide 8 where it says scope of the EIR, that the last bullet point on the left side is geology, soils, and seismicity. So that will be analyzed in the EIR.
Yes, and I think beyond the site itself, the broader impact.
Yeah, no,
And anything
that's
that-
what CEQA focuses on, is impacts off of the site. They don't focus on, it doesn't focus on impacts on the site.
I'd like to address one other concern that I heard, which doesn't really relate specifically to the CEQA process, but it was about the project itself. Now, this meeting is about the EIR and what should be in the EIR, but I think there may be a misperception that the city is sponsoring this project or promoting this project, and also that it's already a done deal. So I just want to reiterate, neither of those are the case. The city is not sponsoring this project or promoting this project. This is a private project being proposed by a private developer, and the city is processing that application. We have found the project to be generally consistent with our general plan. It needs more analysis, but it does conform to the land use and the density and the floor area ratio and all the basic parameters of the general plan. It does appear to conform to those, but we're not proposing this project. We're not promoting this project. We are processing this project for the consideration of the Planning Commission. And no decisions have been made yet. This is not a done deal. There has been one Planning Commission study session. There will be more. And then ultimately there will be a public hearing and there will be a decision made. Whatever the decision is can be appealed to the City Council. And there will be, I did also heard a comment that we're preventing people from talking about the merits of the project tonight. Well, as I said at the beginning, the purpose of this meeting is to talk about what the EIR should include. The merits of the project, there will be lots of opportunities in the future in study sessions and public hearings and probably additional community meetings for people to express their opinions about the merits of the project. So we're certainly not trying to stifle any public input or debate about that. There will be more opportunity for that in the future. It's just that that's not what this particular meeting is about.
Charlie, I really appreciate the fact that you have been talking in plain language that I can understand. Not just these comments, but your previous ones too. I got a much better grasp of what this meeting was about tonight, hearing your comments. Okay, for better or for worse, there's a lot of rumors going around that there are several city council members already committed to this project. I'm not going to name any names, but that's what's being said. And in addition, we're aware of the fact that in the general plan, there are height limits and a bunch of other limits that are now being considered to be changed completely.
No, that's not true.
And well, but that's what's coming out. And so I don't know how you answer that. I'm not thinking the city staff is promoting this project, but I am thinking the city council members are.
Well, let me say that staff has been asked to review the unit mix requirements and the tower separation requirements. Neither of those is in the general plan. So the general plan doesn't have to be changed to address those concerns. The planning regulations may need to be amended, but those issues are not in the general plan. So as I said previously, we have not identified anything so far of great significance that makes this project not consistent with the general plan. No, there is no absolute height limit. It's limited by what's called floor area ratio, which is the amount of square footage of floor area that you can have on a site in relation to the size of the site. In this particular case, that number is 6.0, which means that the total square footage of a building cannot be more than 6 times the site area. And this project complies with that. So with that, if there's no other comments or questions, I think we will adjourn. Thank you.